Welcome to Coffee and Keys, where we blend our expertise and personal experiences to unlock your awareness of the real estate industry.
They're the best.
Here they are.
And now, here's your hosts, Darlene Kemp and Crystal Jacques.
Okay, I'm going to go on record with a full disclosure here. We just did the best podcast we've ever done, and we didn't record it.
We're such amateurs.
So Here we go.
We're gonna do it. Yeah, it's a topic that's been a it's a topic that has been a big buzz going on, right? So a lot of people are talking about it, and
I have avoided this topic for a couple of good reasons. In conversation, because you and I got into a a colorful discussion.
As we do.
Over this topic. And I said, Darlene, I don't want to do it. And the reason why I don't want to do it is because I don't know everything about it. And you said, you don't know it. You don't have to know everything about it.
You know how to represent your buyers. You know how to represent your sellers. You can definitely show your value. It's and we're starting to see it all over the news, and we're seeing things that are not 100% correct. And we're just, you just need to go out there and put it out there and talk about it.
So we need to put it out there. Yeah. It is important. And and I'm sure if you're watching this podcast, you have heard about the new structure and the new way to do business in real estate. And how did this come about? Well, there were some legal challenges this year and a huge settlement, not admitting fault.
Right.
Because of the settlement.
Right. And kind of reorganized and things. So again, we always say, whenever you're trying to do some research or whatever, there's a lot of stuff on the internet and you never know what's real or not. So you went to the source, right? So where did you go to find your info?
I went to the Department of Justice because they're the ones that that's right. They started the lawsuit. Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, there was a couple of class action lawsuits. Right. That happened out there, and it created some legal challenges. And like we said, it had a big settlement, not admitting fault because they settled. However, it is changing the way that realtors and real estate agents do business. Right. And so I think that's important.
Yeah. Yeah. So what are some of the things that they thought was a wrong way to do business?
Okay. So because of the settlement, we have to change a couple of things as an agent. Now, you and I have talked about this over dinner, over lunch, on camera, the things that we have to change. So the first thing is that there were real estate agents out there that did not talk about their commission and how much they're making in commission. And so the change to that is there's no longer commission. It's called agent compensation. And we have to be clear and concise to our buyers that, yes, we do get paid. Yeah. And
you do a really good job for something, you get paid.
That's right. Yeah. I've never had a problem with it, but there's agents or real estate agents or realtors, I don't know which one, but they have led some of the buyers out there to believe that their services are for free.
Right.
Because the buyer
don't worry
didn't see the money.
Don't worry about my compensation, the seller's going to pay for it.
The seller's going to pay for it.
Right.
So I work for you for free.
Yeah, don't worry.
And that is further from the truth.
Right. Because if you're looking out for the buyer and you're getting paid by the seller, when you go to negotiate that contract for the seller, it's all about the bottom line, right? So somehow it is affecting negotiations, and the buyer should just be aware on who you're working for, right? And how much you get paid for your services. And it's about explaining, your value and what you do and your worth.
Your worth. And that should be, I mean, anybody that's going to, well, not everybody, but people that buy homes have to go to work, some of them, to pay for the house. Right. So do we.
Yeah. Yeah.
We have jobs.
Yeah.
We get
Well,
paid.
yeah, and it's an industry that has a lot of moving parts, and a lot
It
of moving
does.
parts has time frame where things have to get done. And there's somebody that's got to hold your hand all along the way and
Right.
understand what trouble you can get into when you're writing contracts, and understanding what they mean and what you should look out for, and really understanding the market and how you negotiate contracts and what's norm and what's not norm, and so
Right.
all those things come into play that the professionals are there doing on a daily basis. So they're absolutely worth what they get paid. I think it's just a matter of the lawsuit pointing out that they just wanted full disclosure so that you can sit
That
down and
and
have a
that's the
good,
big
good,
thing is
yeah.
we have to, as a realtor or real estate agent, now we have to disclose. And
Hmm.
we're going to tell you a little bit how we disclose that because there's different ways. But
Hmm.
another thing, and I have seen this done, I have heard agents talk about it, is steering the buyer away from a house that the buyer wants to see based on what the seller was offering for agent compensation.
Hmm.
I have heard agents talk about that. I will not show a house for less than this. I will
Yeah.
not show a house. My
Right.
time is
Right.
valuable. I have
Right.
heard all of that. Well, guess
Right.
what? You
It only
can't do it
Right,
anymore.
because it only hurts the buyer. I mean, what if the buyer would have
Right.
said, "Well, wait a minute. That could be my perfect
Hmm.
forever home, and you're not showing it to me because
Hmm.
it only pays this much of a commission. I want to see it. And if it means I have to pay your compensation, then a lot of times they've been willing to do that, but you haven't
To do
given them
that.
that opportunity to do that." So again, not all agents were participating in that. But then here's the other thing. A lot of times they were saying, "Hey, well, $2,000 bonus for full priced offer." Well, the buyer says, "Well, I didn't want to make a full priced
That's
offer."
gone.
So how can you? Yeah. So how are you working for me when the seller is incentivizing you, and the seller saying,
Yes.
"Why am I paying for an agent that is working for the best interest of the buyer? I'm got to pay for him. Why am I paying for somebody to beat me up in a negotiation? That's not
Right.
fair, right?" So I
That
think
that's
when you
not
look at it that way and in that bigger, broader picture, it kind of makes sense a little bit. And again, I don't think the agents were necessary. And there's always the bad apple, right? But I don't think
right.
agents were doing anything wrong. It was just doing what the industry was having them do at the moment. So that's why they did
Or
the
allowing.
settlement, or allowing, right? So the settlement is
Hmm.
simply saying, okay, well, I can understand where you're coming
You can't
from,
do that.
right? But let's make some changes, and
Yeah.
let's have it all full disclosure, and let's you know do things that is not steering borrowers to one property or another simply for compensation. Because let's face it, when you're working for a buyer or you're working for a seller, you're, as an agent, you're looking out for their best interest. And if you're
Right.
only looking out for your commission, how are you looking out for their best interest? So it's better just to get your agent compensation agreed upon right up front, because you're worth it, and now you can move on to doing what's best for
You
the
can,
buyer.
that's right. What's
Yeah.
best for the buyer. Now,
Uh-huh.
I complained about that. I have listed my own homes. Some agents are afraid to do that because there's an emotional attachment
Yeah.
to the house. And I, I'm not emotionally attached to a home. I have listed my own house, but I did mention, and I think I mentioned it to you on one of them, is so I have to pay an agent to negotiate against me,
Yeah.
you know?
So now you got to see what some sellers were thinking or feeling during that
Right,
transaction. But let's
right.
take it let's take it back a little bit, since we started getting on as far as who gets paid. And
Okay,
and really, if you've got a first time home buyer, they probably don't even know how you get paid, right? If they've
okay,
never
they
met
don't.
with you, they don't. A lot of people just don't know, how anybody
Okay,
gets paid until you tell them. But
and I got my notes because I want to be careful on this one because I don't know everything. However, I do know, I do know this. So now there's going to be a clear division. Number one is we're going to have to be transparent about what we
Mhm.
make, and how are we transparent? Well, through negotiation, because
Mhm.
everything is negotiable. And I don't know how many buyers and sellers were not told that, but I'm putting it out there. Everything is negotiable. So each side, seller, buyer, has hires their agent.
Mhm.
You know,
And they each
so
have different responsibilities. The
and
seller
they
agent
have
has a
different
responsibility to this.
responsibilities.
Buyer's agent has a responsibility to this.
So the seller hires their agent when they sit down and they do the listing agreement. Now, I happen to be listing heavy right now, so I have been in one listing appointment after another recently. And so I bring up this topic. It's funny because everybody knows about it, but they don't know the truth about it, or
They
what
hear
we're
all
being
this
told.
misconception
They
on the
hear
news
chatter out there on the news. All they know is, I don't have to pay anymore.
Yeah.
And I go, well, everything's negotiable. And let me tell you why you might want to negotiate that pay, and set it straight. And then I see the aha. Okay, yes, I do. I do want to pay. Okay. So the seller sits down at the listing agreement, and that's when the listing agent talks about their compensation, and they sign what we call a listing agreement, or better known to us legally as an employment agreement. Okay, so now the buyer does the same thing. The buyer, it used to be that the buyer did not have to sign it up front. Well, that's changing. The buyer has to sign an employment agreement, or better known as a buyer broker's agreement. And in that agreement, it talks about the agent's compensation. So the buyer is committing to paying their agent in that compensation. Now, before the smoke starts coming out of everybody's head, and the questions start, and I've heard this, I can't afford you. I can't afford to pay you. Let me tell you how that's done. So the buyer, because
Get that out of the way right now.
Don't turn it off the podcast now, people. Don't turn it off now.
It really will be business as usual. Just kind
it will.
But yeah.
So the buyer sits down with their agent, and are actually, before you can even go out and see a house now, this has to be signed. And it hasn't been that way in every state.
But again, I think
as
that
you
that
know,
could be
I'm
a
in
really
2 different states.
Yeah, and I think that could be a really good thing for buyers, though, to be able to really sit down and know what they're getting into before they start the whole process. So it's really just kind of bringing, full disclosure. I know there's a lot of agents out there that are really going, how am I going to explain my value, and how am I, what my worth is? But that's what you've been getting paid for doing this job.
That's what we do.
So nothing is going to change there, really. You're just simply having to have that conversation up front, rather than them having to ask you, why aren't you showing me that house? Right now, you can
you're
go take
get
them
to know your
and see
agent.
every house. Yeah. And you want to make sure you're a good fit to work with each other, right?
Yeah. So yeah, I was saying in the previous podcast that early in my career, I was afraid to do that, and for a couple of reasons. One is, what if I don't like the client? What if the client doesn't like me? But we're in this employment agreement, So, and this was early, years and years and years and years ago. I wouldn't get it signed up front. And I would say, well, let's just test the water. Let's kick the tires, see if we're a good fit. If we're not a good fit, you didn't sign anything. But now you have to.
Yeah.
Now,
or you may not
we
get
have
paid.
to.
Yeah.
Or I won't get paid.
Yeah. And let's take it back a little bit farther, because I know when you got in, when did you get? I can't remember.
12 years ago?
Yeah. Okay. So I did real estate about 36 years ago. Yeah. now I'm really selling my age.
How could you do that, Darlene? And you're only 29.
Okay, I was young. But and this is the state of Virginia, so I didn't know all sorts of other states. And again, I was young in the industry. But when I got in the industry, all agents worked for the seller.
Yes.
That was it.
You are correct.
They represented the seller in a transaction. So when an agent went out and got a listing appointment, they negotiated their compensation based on doing all parts of the transaction. And again, remember, that was back in the day before we had internet and all that other stuff. And, we used to find houses out of a little book. Now I'm really showing my age. But so the listing agent would hire you to market, sell, negotiate. They were paying you to do the whole job. Right. And then they started doing what's known as co-brokering, which means that, okay, if there's an agent in their office or an agent in another office that had a buyer that liked your house, they could come show your house and write the offer on it. And for them doing that part of the job, you might split that commission. So the
Right.
seller would pay the listing agent the full thing, and the listing agent was the one that would pay the other agent for helping out in that transaction,
Mm-hmm.
right? But all parties at that time represented the seller. So in other words, if a buyer at that time said, I really like that house, but I might be willing to pay $300,000 for it, but I'm going to try and negotiate him down to $240,000. Well, guess what
Mm-hmm.
that agent had to do because they were representing the seller? They had to go back and tell the seller
Tell the
exactly what that
seller.
buyer said, and then that
Yeah.
buyer's and
We have
then
to
yeah,
disclose.
you have to disclose because you're in the seller's
Mm-hmm.
best interest. So if they said they're
Yeah.
willing to pay for it, then you need to tell your seller, hey, he's willing to pay for it, because that's who you're
Right.
representing in that transaction. Is an agency relationship, right?
Right.
So then there was a bunch of lawsuits that came out by buyers at that time, not by the sellers, but by the buyers. So why it took 36
Mm-hmm.
years to get here, I don't know. But the buyers, the buyers at that time said, wait a minute. I've been spending all day with you. We've been looking at all these houses. You've been talking to me about this, that, and the other, and you've been really helping me out with understanding neighborhoods and schools and all that kind of stuff. And you're trying to tell me now that you don't work for me? I've been spilling
Misleading.
my guts to you,
I
telling you
know.
everything that I would and wouldn't do, and I didn't know you don't represent me. You represent the
Yeah.
seller. So then there was a big lawsuit that came out at that time, and that really kind of brought that buyer broker into fruition, because basically what we were told at that time, when that dust settled on there, was that, okay, fine, if you want to represent a buyer, then you have to get a buyer broker signed at that
Mm-hmm.
time. And then when you call that selling agent, the first thing you have to say is, I'm representing the buyer in this transaction. Can you tell me a
That's
little bit
right.
about this property, right? Because now the
Right.
selling agent would know she can't tell you everything. My seller said he'd take 240, but we're listing at 300. If you tell that to a buyer's agent, they have to go back and tell the buyer that, right?
They have to. That's right.
How is that working for your seller if you're going to, spill that information out to them? So it really had to do with kind of negotiating who's representing who and who has that fiduciary responsibility, right? And we all know that when we worked in this industry, we're really looking out for the best interests of our clients, the buyer or the seller. It's
We
not
should be.
really,
Yes.
it's not really all about our commission.
No. And
We
that I think we
Deb,
talked a little
yeah,
bit about that.
yeah, we do
Yeah.
you did you're worth every penny that you do, because there's a lot of things that you do, and a lot of people are so much behind. And here's the thing: if the buyer doesn't think you're doing anything, that means you're doing an amazing job, because they haven't had to get involved. It's being done behind the scenes without them really even know about it, right? And you've probably
It's a
avoided
lot.
100 different mistakes and things that could happen, things that could go wrong. So your compensation, is well deserved. But again, it should be negotiated up front. When you go get employed at a job, they're going to tell you, hey, I'll pay you $25 an hour. I'll pay you $30 an hour. You're not
Right.
going in every day wondering what you're going to get paid, right? And so I think that this
Right.
is really good, because right up front, you know what you're going to get paid, and you know who you have to represent and who you're looking out for and in their best interest. So it's full
That's
disclosure.
true.
Right.
That's
So
and I like that. I like the
yeah.
disclosure, and I think we talked a little bit about when a buyer walks into your office, they have to open up their books. They have to give you W-2s.
Yeah.
They
As a
have to.
lender, I
You
get
look
all
at
of
their
it.
bank statements. You look at all
Right.
of that
Yeah.
stuff.
Right. So
So now we have
have
to
to.
do it too to the people that we work for.
Mhm.
So I don't mind. I mean, I always say I sing like a canary. I mean, I don't mind. I have
I
nothing to
share it.
hide.
Yeah.
Yeah. So now, because we were so used to not doing it and
Yeah.
not talking about it, that now we have to do it. So we
Right.
do it through on a buyer side, a buyer broker agreement.
Mhm.
So just a little bit about that, because I know people are like, and I know the buyers that I have now, I can't afford you.
Yeah.
Well,
The big, oh
yeah,
my gosh, how am I going to do that? I'm trying to
how
buy a
am I
house. I
going to
got
do
down payment. I
that?
got closing costs. I got this, and now I
Right.
got to have pay that. So, yes. But again, I think it's going to come back to business as usual once you just realize this is really how it's already been done anyway. The
It's no
seller,
different.
right? So now,
The seller can offer
to-
concessions.
yeah, to
And
pay.
so then agent compensation can be a concession.
Right.
They
You can
can
negotiate that
you
in
can
the
negotiate
contract.
that as part of the concessions.
Right.
So you put a number or a pineapple or 25 pineapples on that buyer broker as to the agreement between the agent and the buyer. The buyer has promised the agent 25 pineapples, right? So the buyer says, but I don't live by a Dole cannery. I cannot produce 25 pineapples. How am I going to give you 25 pineapples? Well, don't worry about that, because I can negotiate that with the seller, and let that be the seller's problem if they agree to provide 25 pineapples.
Right.
So
And
we go to the house. You know, the buyer finds the house that they like. You know, we write an offer and we present it. And in that offer, the buyer says, I would like my agent to be paid 25 pineapples as agent compensation. And the seller comes back and says, done.
yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
guess
And it's
what?
the same thing as if, I mean, one of the things I told you, a lot of times what happens is the buyer will come to you all excited about, wanting to see houses. And you're so, well, wait a minute, let's make sure that you're approved, right? So you're going to send them over to me first. And I'm going to look at everything and I'm going to say, okay, income's this, credit looks good. Everything looks good. This is the dollar amount of a sales price that they can afford based on this payment in today's interest rate market. And oh, by the way, I've looked at their bank statements and their funds, and I'll have that discussion with them about how much they want to put down for a down payment, and here's what your closing costs are going to be, and and that now I'm going to also say, and your agent compensation. So these are the amount of money that you need to come to closing with, and if they say, well, I don't have that, well, again, and even in the old days when I said, you have some funds, but it's not enough for the down payment and closing cost. The only way we can get this to be an approved loan is if your agent can negotiate those closing costs for you, right? So then I'd call you back and I say, look, they look great on paper as far as income and debt to income ratio, and this is the sales price they're at. However, they don't have all of the funds for their down payment and closing cost. So they have to pay their own down payment, but on this loan program, they're allowed to ask for so much in closing cost assistance. So you have to negotiate that into the contract if you need, in order for them to ratify a contract. Because remember, when they're signing and ratifying a contract, they're saying that they can fulfill
the contract.
down payment, closing costs, the concessions, everything that they've already agreed to up front. So they're negotiating the contract. So now it kind of actually opens up a whole new world for buyers, because you're not limited to just showing them houses that pay them so much of a commission that they agreed to. You can show them everything, and it's all about negotiating. It's all about okay. We can start and we can ask. And if this one doesn't do it, then we move on to the next house, and we'll find you one that we can get you done.
I heard this years ago, and it's true, that if I cannot negotiate my pay, then how am I going to negotiate on your behalf?
Right. Exactly.
So I don't have a problem with doing that, because you know me, I have all my ducks in a row as to why, I believe that I'm worth what we're talking about. Yeah. But if I cannot stand up against the buyer and negotiate that, then the buyer, how am I going to go negotiate on the buyer's behalf?
Right. And the fear to the buyers, I think, of all this, now I'm never going to be able to afford to buy a house. I'm like, well, wait a minute. You're not thinking this logically.
Don't be afraid, people.
Don't be afraid. It's going to come out in the wash, because remember, what's most important to a seller? Typically, it's the bottom line, right? And we all know that, buyers have been able to come up and pay $10,000 above appraised value and all this other kind. But it's all about negotiating, right? Yeah. So it just depends on the market. Again, when I started in the industry 36 years ago, the normal listing time was minimum 6 months. It was taking sellers 6 months to sell their houses, right? And now we're selling in 3 days, 4 days a week, and people are panicking when it's been 30 days, which is, a norm is 2 to 3 months, at least 4 months of inventory, right? So, having a seller have their house on the market, there could come a time where we're going to see that again. So if somebody brings you a contract and it's about your bottom line and it meets your bottom line, what does the seller really care about where the funds go from? They know that agent is representing the buyer, so there's no worry about there. So they're really not paying the buyer just to negotiate against them, right? They're paying to sell their house. They're negotiating. So they're negotiating that compensation as much as they're negotiating in closing costs to a buyer who needs closing costs. So it's really going to determine what the market is going to bear, right? We've always said, what is your house really worth? It's what somebody's willing to pay you for it, right? Yeah. So again, it just brings out a clearer view picture when it comes to negotiating, right? So now
Right.
you're not leading, and I know you would never do it anyway, but there were some agents that led their borrower out to houses that paid them the most money. Well, that's not what it's about. You
You
want
can't do
to,
that.
yeah. So you negotiate your fee right up front, so that clears the plate, right? And that's kind of, I think, what you said was in that lawsuit too. They didn't want you to steer buyers to one property or another just based on the
Or
commission.
another.
They want to
And
open it up so you can show them whatever they want to see, and then it's up to negotiations from there.
that's true.
Yeah.
And the agent cannot collect more than what's on that buyer
Right.
broker agreement.
Right.
So,
So it's all
the
negotiating.
days of giving
Yeah,
what are the
$2,000
bonuses?
yeah. So
Yeah.
so how are you working for a buyer when you show them a house that says $2,000 bonus to the agent on a full price offer? Well, what if your buyer doesn't want to make a full price offer? I mean, how can you make
Right.
that fair and
Yeah,
yeah.
how can
So
I tell you
yeah.
what, those things made me so uncomfortable.
Yeah.
They really did, but I would always disclose that there's a bonus involved in the listing.
Right.
You know, I would tell them, I would show them in
Yeah.
the MLS.
Yeah.
Look at this.
Yeah.
You
yeah.
know,
And
you
that's
make your
yeah,
decision.
decisions. Right.
You
And
make
see,
your decision.
now they're taking all of that out. They're
Yep,
not
you can't
putting
do that
any
anymore.
compensation for an agent in the NL because they don't want you to steer buyers to one way or another just because of that compensation. You know,
That's
so
right.
now you're going to have to show. Now you're going to have to do your job. You're going to have to show the buyer the houses that they want to see, and understanding that if they don't have the funds to pay closing costs and compensation, they may have to do
Then we
some negotiating.
negotiate.
And if this seller don't going to go negotiate, then you'll find them another house that will. Then this house may
Yeah.
not be right for them, right? So it's just
Or
going to be
like
business.
yeah, or like when you brought this up, maybe you're close enough because in the buyer broker, you can put 25 pineapples in there, and then the seller says, you know what, I'll only pay 24. The agent can come down to 24 pineapples, but they can't go up to 26 pineapples.
Right. In other words, if the seller says, "Hey, I'll pay you $2,000 if you just give me a full price offer," well, guess what? You can no longer take that because you've already got your agreement with the buyer that
That's
this is
right.
what you're
You've
going to
got
be
your
paid. So you
agreement.
can't take any more than that, right? So now
That's
you can say,
right.
"Seller, I tell you what, why don't you give the $2,000 to my buyer and negotiate this contract?" Right.
Yeah.
So again, it
Yeah.
can really put everything out on the table that you're really negotiating for what's in the best interest of the person that you're representing. The selling
It's
agent
going to
is
keep
going to, yeah,
it's going to keep a lot of people honest. It's going to keep
Yeah.
I think it's going to keep the industry honest because we
yeah.
have to tell.
Yeah, yeah, like absolutely, and it's all about full disclosure. And I think that's what the whole
Right.
point of the lawsuit was
Right.
to begin with. Is they said, they don't want you to steer borrowers based on your commission, how you're really representing them. And oh, by the way, sellers, you shouldn't be told you have to pay a buyer's agent's compensation when they're negotiating against you. I understand that. Now, negotiating it in for the best deal, yeah, especially in the days where you get 2 or 3 different offers in, if you get one that's asking for compensation for the agent and closing costs and one that's not asking for anything, which one do you think they're going to take? But if they put it in the listing, then they're obligated to do it, and then they're not being able to negotiate fairly, right?
Right.
So
Exactly.
this just kind of brings up, clarifies full disclosure on
Full
all
disclosure.
parts, right?
Absolutely. And you know me, there's been times where I would say, in good conscience, Darlene, I can't advise my client to do this or advise. I mean, because I see the end of the road. I see how it could go. And it's not, the sale is not that important to me to mislead somebody to get the sale done. First and foremost, what we do is we change lives. We sell
Homeownership.
homes.
Yeah.
Home ownership.
Big believer.
That
I've always
is in
believed.
the front.
Yeah.
Now, like everybody else, and I've had to say this to sellers and buyers, and yes, I do want to be paid for what I do. There's have
value.
No guilt when it comes to that.
Yeah, there's value
I'm
in what
do
you
my
do.
job.
Yeah,
yeah.
And by having a good skilled agent there to do that job from beginning to end, then when you're good at the negotiating, the seller's going to get the top dollar and what's important to him, and that agent's going to represent him in that. And when you get a good buyer's agent, the buyer's going to get the best deal that's best for them, right? Because it's all about showing them what the choices are, and they get to make the choices. Right?
Yeah.
And
exactly.
the choices, if I show you this house, here's, we're going to negotiate it. Everything's out on the table. You know exactly, what you're looking at there,
Mhm.
especially if you've gone to a lender and they've given you all your closing costs and then you know exactly what you're going to have to come out of pocket with. Things go a lot smoother when it's all done up front rather
I
than,
think so. I think it's
hidden.
the money that kind of muddies the water
Yeah,
sometimes. But now that everything is up front, they see on the closing disclosures, and it's funny because people see these big numbers and they look and they say, "Wow, you get that?" No, I don't.
No. The
I do
broker
not
gets
get that.
and then he splits
The
it here and
broker
that,
gets that. And
and
then it gets cut up. It gets cut up. And here's my piece right here. And then there's this piece.
Well,
And then there's this piece.
Yeah, I mean, you're kind of self-employed too, so you have expenses and things like that
I
too.
have
And
expenses. I have
so
to
you're
pay
not giving them
taxes.
your net sheet. And it really just is about a service. And you've been getting paid that in the past anyway, based on it, and it's negotiated in the contract. And I think that's really the full point too. This is something that you've been paid. Yeah, you said the seller is going to pay it for you, but it's negotiated in that bottom line. So it's going to be negotiated in that price one way or another. And at least now you know exactly what that price is. So we can go negotiate with the seller fairly. Right. So I think that's full. And I think what it's going to do too is it's going to really help keep professionals in our industry, right? Because if
I agree.
if you are a professional up front, you'll be able to explain to the buyer what your value is and how you can really help them get the house that they're looking for and negotiate on their behalf. Make sure that home inspection guidelines are taken and that the time frames are not missed and that you don't miss on a chance to opportunity to negotiate, repairs or any of that along the way. There's so much that you do on that back end that you don't miss that opportunity to do that. So I think what's going to happen is you're really going to kind of weed the industry out. And I think I said on the last one,
so.
the Buffini,
people that are afraid of it are going to go away because it's easier not to face it.
As I heard on, I think it was a Buffini podcast that he was talking about, we've had a really busy, crazy time where people were, you could get into this business and you didn't have to have any skill or knowledge to really make a living in it because it was just moving so fast, right? So the tide was in, right? And everybody jumped in the water and started working in this business. And now you really have to show who's the professional, right? Because what happens when the tide goes out? You see who's been swimming naked. Right. so that was, so now the tide's moving out and you're going to look at all the agents that are not skilled and that were, have not been kept up on their trade, have not, really looking out for the best interests of the buyer that they're representing and haven't been looking out at the best interest for the seller that they're representing. And they haven't really stayed educated and trained and skilled in this industry. That tide's going to move out and we're going to see who's been swimming naked. Right. And so the professionals will rise to the top.
I was talking to an agent early this morning and I said, "Are you ready for August 17th?" And he's like, "What's happening August 17th?" I'm like, "Okay." So we have spent, and I think you and I and my team in Virginia have spent getting educated. We have spent the year getting educated on this topic.
Yeah. And understanding that there's a benefit to all sides.
Yes, there is.
On the new changes. Anything new is hard to, capture. And then you've got the news media that's feeding all sorts of negative energy into it. And it really just is, I think it's going to wash out to be business as usual. And that, it's really going to be in the best interest of the buyer and the seller. And it's full disclosure, full negotiations. And the pros will figure it out.
The cream will rise to the top.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Yeah.
It's funny. I was talking to the mother of a buyer that I have, and I was educating her on this whole situation. And she's like, "My gosh." And I said, "Yeah, a lot of good changes. But I tell you what, there's a lot of people out there saying that the fix for this in our industry is to get more listings." And I'm not that agent. I'm like, I want more buyers. I want to get them in the house.
Yeah.
I want to get them in the house. And I go, "I don't know how I'm going to do it, But you know what? It
You're
always
going to
happens
negotiate
if you
through it.
work
Yeah.
hard enough.
Yeah.
Yeah, you
Because the
negotiate.
buyer's the one who really needs the hand holding in a transaction.
They
Yes, the
do.
seller needs marketing, and the seller needs to understand what the market is and what it's doing, and whether or not they're being realistic with their pricing and negotiating, and knowing what kind of buyers out there. Do they need closing costs? Do they not? So yes, they need a pro on that end. But the buyer is the one who's looking at spending a whole lot of money in one sitting, and it's
Oh,
something that it's
yeah.
a house that they're going to be living in. It's going to become their home.
Biggest asset that you'll buy.
Yeah, it's it's an investment, not just a home, but it's
Right.
also a home. So there's so much into it, and I really think it's the buyers that are going to reap the most benefit from this in the long run, knowing right up front what
I think
what
so.
they're
I
getting
mean, they
into
get to
through negotiations.
interview, and something that didn't happen. I mean, how many buyers did I get? And I know me, I will beat a dead horse. Until it comes back to life. So I know I will do my research, and there's been plenty of times that I am up at 2 a.m. trying to research something, or blowing you up
There's
at
a
1
text.
a.m.
Aren't you sleeping?
Yeah, trying to get an answer. I know me, but there's been plenty of times that I have gotten a client through a recommendation of a client there, and they didn't ask me one question.
Yeah.
They did not ask me, how do you get paid? They did not ask me, who is that person sitting across the table from us? They didn't ask me anything.
Or not even that. They didn't even ask you, who are you representing in the transaction?
Who are you
Because remember,
representing?
36 years ago,
Are you here for
you were
me?
working with them and you were representing the sellers. So
Right.
who are you working
But
for?
I know
Who's
me,
interested?
and there's been plenty of times that I would say, thank goodness they are with me.
Yeah.
I mean, seriously, because they could have gotten in the wrong hands, and they could have, been stared away from that house that they want.
Yeah.
So, I mean, this should give them the opportunity, since the buyers are going to commit to paying their representative up front. They commit. But again,
it's not paid up front. So again, not to scare them off. You don't have to have. Yeah, they're going to commit up front.
They're going to commit up front.
But when do you get paid?
At the end of the transaction.
Yeah, once you've done your job and everything's cleared.
Until you can commit all you want, but until that contract, or we have, what did Kedron say? Meeting of the minds.
Yeah.
Everybody agrees. Nothing matters until then. And I would think that these agents that let that happen, the meeting of the minds, and there's a commitment, it's because it works for their buyer.
Mm-hmm.
Until then, it doesn't matter. You could put how many pineapples you want on that line, but until, and maybe you can't afford the pineapples, but until you figure out how those pineapples are going to pay your representative, because again, we deserve to be paid. Mm-hmm. We go out and we work. I carry a lot of clients at one time, and believe me, my husband's, goes to the bathroom at 4 a.m. and I'm at my desk. I mean, it will give those buyers the chance to find that agent.
Right. That's willing to work for them.
Rather than just take me out and sell me something.
So what is going to be the advantage to the buyer now is the buyer will have choices, and they'll be given choices, and they can, just like listing agents might, interview a couple agents. Buyer will have the opportunity to do that too. But again, really it's about that referral. Yeah. I really think it's that they got to trust who they're hiring, right? On the job, to do the job.
Yeah. And they should. I mean, they really should. Either it's going to work or it's not. So I think it's a great thing. I honestly do. Mm-hmm. I've always operated as who I am.
Yeah.
Can't say, so I can't say that it hasn't worked out, but I'm also 100% honest. And that's one of my things. I go, well, do you want the truth? I don't know if you want the truth, but guess what? I'm going to tell you the truth.
And
you know?
and it's their choice. You tell them the
That's
truth, and it's their choice,
choice.
right? So you're not slamming some house
Right.
that they should buy this one because you're going to get a $2,000 bonus, right?
No.
You're really looking out for their best interest to get the house that you think is going to
Yeah.
benefit them. And really, if you find them a house and they don't have the funds for closing costs and compensation, all that thing, maybe that's just not their house that the seller's not willing to help
It's
them
not their
negotiating.
house.
So you move on to the next one. And how many times have we heard when one doesn't work out, sometimes they get a house that they like that better anyway?
It
You know?
always works
So it
out
really
like
is about,
that.
negotiating and working with the same, client, so I think it's
Yeah.
really going to be a good thing. It's going to show professionalism. It's going to show clarity. And now when you go to negotiate a contract, you have you have all your options on the table, right?
Yeah.
So you know exactly what you're dealing with. And the seller can
Definitely.
negotiate based on all the contracts put in front of him. So if he's having to choose a contract which has compensation or not, then that's up to him in negotiating. But if he doesn't have any contracts on the table, even though he said he wouldn't pay him, who knows? You write the offer,
Yeah.
he may change his mind and pay it anyway. So it's just about working through those issues. And that's what you do. And that's what you get paid the
Yeah.
big bucks for, right?
Well, that, I do know that if a buyer wants to see a house and they're under a employment agency or agreement with us,
Yeah.
we got to show them the house.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
We
And
have to. That has been like that forever, as far as I know.
Yeah. And it gives them an opportunity.
Except for if they don't qualify for the house, because
Well-
you have those buyers that don't qualify. It's way out of their price range.
Well, and again, it's being able to be realistic. Absolutely.
Right.
Because your
Right.
job is to work with somebody and find, who's ready, willing, and able to buy. Right.
Right. Exactly.
And so that's what your job is when you're interviewing the buyer in that position. Because it's not just the buyer interviewing you and saying, I want to work with this agent.
I interview
You're also
them.
is this really somebody that I want to work with as a buyer too? Do I believe that I can make a difference for them? Do I believe, that I can work with them? Are they going to be honest with me? Are they qualified? Are they, are they ready to buy? All those things. So,
I mean, you're right,
yeah.
though, because my pet peeve. If I call you, I want you to answer the phone.
Yeah.
And so I have that agreement with every buyer and every seller.
It's setting the expectations.
I don't call I don't
Set those
call just to, chit chat. I
Yeah.
call because we're doing business and I need an answer. That's why I call.
Yeah.
So you set the expectations there. They get to see your personality. They, at that point, either, they make the decision. Do they want to be with you? And you make the decision. Do you want to be with them?
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So I'm kind of looking forward to the new era of real estate.
We'll see, Darlene.
I just, I'm glad we did this because I'm just, if anything else, what I want to come out of this podcast and talking about compensation, which I know is always, a hard thing to talk about, because people don't like to brag about themselves and tell them everything that they're worth, right? It's sometimes a hard conversation to have, but you have to nowadays, to show your professionalism. But I really think it's going to be a good thing. And what we've been hearing so many negative buzzes, it's going to really, and I'm thinking,
I was hearing it.
Yeah. And not only
and
hearing
I do it for a living.
Yeah. You'd walk into an office and you go, oh, what's going on in here? Right. What is everybody so worried about? And yes, it's going to be a change. And yes, some buyers may think that it's the worst thing ever, but in the long run, when it comes to getting a professional to help negotiate what you need in order to get into a house and to steer you in the right direction, it really is going to be worth it to them in the long run to work with a professional.
We're licensed for a reason.
This is true.
Not everybody can do what we do for money.
Exactly.
We're licensed for a reason.
Right. And you have to go through continuing ed and all those other kind of things. So I think it's going to be a good change once everybody gets used to it. Everybody hates change. Change is always, but I'm just glad we did the podcast because I just wanted to put a positive spin on these changes and show everybody that there could be a lot of good coming out of these changes. And that's kind of what we're looking for. And not just the good of the seller's going to sell money. No, he's going to have a clearer negotiating. He's not just going to not have to pay a buyer's agent. It's just that he can negotiate freely and get to his bottom line with all the contracts. Well,
I agree.
So,
and I'm glad you twisted my arm. You gave me a week to think about it.
Put a positive spin on it. And again, I love this industry. I am a huge believer that it's always a good time to buy a house. house values have
Always.
gone up, and even during those time frames. But I think it's always a good time to buy a house that you can call your own. It's an investment. It's something that, can make money over
Yeah.
time.
I agree with you. I think everybody needs to own their own house.
Yeah.
Honestly.
So much freedom to that, right? I can
Yeah,
paint the walls whatever
definitely.
color I want to.
Or do the bathroom 100 times over.
I'm going to get it my way.
I'm going to get it my way. All right.
Awesome.
Well, it was great.
good.
And,
Yeah.
I have to thank you for putting my back to the wall to have this conversation.
It's a hard one to have
We've had
sometimes,
it a
but-
lot between us. We've debated it between us.
Yeah.
We've talked about the good, the bad, and the ugly.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Pros and
So
cons,
I am glad. And
Yeah,
you were
we put it out
right
there.
about a few things that I found out in the week that it took me to think about it.
Good.
So-
Good. And again, it's a great business. And
Mm-hmm.
I really think it's going to benefit all the professionals.
I think so too. I think it's going to be like a strainer. You're going to put these people in, and the ones that fall apart are going to fall out the bottom.
So we'll have to put this on our calendar, and we'll come back from a year now and re-talk about this topic.
We'll see.
Yeah. All right.
All
Here
right.
we go.
Coffee and Keys is brought to you by Darlene Kemp, VP, Senior Loan Officer, NMLS ID 173897. Atlantic Coast Mortgage, LLC is an equal housing lender. NMLS ID 643114. www.nmlsconsumeraccess.org. And Crystal Jacques, Realtor for both Remax Allegiance, 4000 Virginia Beach Boulevard, Suite 164, Virginia Beach, Virginia 23452. Office phone 757-490-7300. And Remax Professionals, 20241 North 67th Avenue, Suite A1 Glendale, Arizona 85308. Office phone 623-362-3000. Each office is independently owned and operated and supports the Fair Housing Act and equal opportunity housing.